Um, and again, I know that there are those who practice this idea of pedo baptism, infant baptism, and their response is, well, the sin of Adam, of course, is carried over unto a child. And I'm thinking of the passage that says that the child does not inherit the sins of the father. And that is true, and it's consistent throughout the New Testament that anyone who comes to God and believes, understands what they're doing, becomes a subject for God's plan. And so therefore, of course, those who cannot and those who don't have that ability to understand, such as an infant child, God considers completely innocent before him. Sometimes you hear the term used safe, that an innocent child, an infant child, is neither saved nor lost, simply because they don't have the ability to know God's will in a way that an adult, or I should say adult, but a person who's reached an age where they can understand, they can read the Word of God, they can know it, and make a decision to obey or disobey. Now, there are those who will go on and say, well, we'll baptize this infant and then we'll teach him, okay? And so then when they reach a certain age, then we'll confirm that baptism. Because yes, now they can understand, but that goes against every principle of baptism that we find in the New Testament. Those who learned and those who understood the Word obeyed the gospel, and then they were baptized. Never before were they baptized, and then they said, well, after a while, we'll teach you what this was all about. And so those, both of those situations where one is baptized because they say they're born in sin, or because, you know, there's some idea that this child needs to be baptized in order to enter in heaven, break those two principles.
Well, you know, I think about what Jesus said when he said, suffer the little children to come unto me.
That's right.
And here's the key. He says, for such is the kingdom of heaven. Well, if a little child is born a sinner, then in essence what we have Jesus saying is, let the little wicked children come to me, because the kingdom of heaven is just like them. You know, that's not what Jesus was saying at all. A little child is not born in sin. A little child is born safe. Right. And sometimes we sing the song, Safe in the Arms of Jesus. And certainly that's the case with a child. So it's a tragic thing from the parent's perspective when a little child suffers the fate of death. But on the other hand, as a parent, if I have had an infant to die, I can have the confidence that truly that little child is safe in the arms of Jesus.
Absolutely.
Appreciate your good response to that question. Here's another question that has been raised, and it has to do with children as well. It has to do actually with discipline, and I'm going to ask Chad if he would to share his thoughts. But it says, it really is two-part. When is a child old enough to be spanked, and how should it be done?
It's a very good question. I don't know that you could put a set age on when a child is old enough to be spanked. Okay. I know a lot of people try to put it much older than it really should be, at least a lot of people that I have come across. I knew a lady and her husband that they would have their son on the changing table at just a few months old. And if he acted up getting a diaper change, he'd get a little swat. And if he kept acting up, he'd get 2 swats, and it went on. And I'm telling you, this child was just a few months old, but he learned very quickly to lie very still when he was getting his diaper changed. But, you know, children are a lot of times smarter than we think. I have a little 2-year-old who can answer several Bible questions. He can quote several verses because it's a matter of repetition, but he's intelligent enough to learn those. It's not just because he's got a smart daddy, or a smart mama, but it's because the little children are smart. They're much smarter than we give them credit for. And many times a child knows what no means. Sometimes we don't give them that credit, and they need to understand when mom or dad says no and you keep going, there are consequences.
And I think we ought to point out here, because it's certainly a legitimate point to raise, that spanking is not necessarily the only form of discipline
Absolutely.
that ought to be used. And but at the same time, when we come to the Scriptures absolutely teach that it is an appropriate form of discipline.
Yes.
And some children respond better to spanking, and some children may respond better to being grounded or having something taken away from them. And so as a parent, we have to use wisdom.
Right.
And, we have to determine what works best for the mindset of the child that I particularly have. But again, I think that's an excellent point. As far as when is a child old enough, well, that's like asking, when does a child reach the age of accountability?
Yeah, it's hard to pinpoint.
I mean, it varies per child, but I appreciate what you shared there about, how the parent began in a small way and then, increased if the child continued to misbehave. But and I do think that sometimes as parents, especially young parents, we want to do what's right. We want to make sure our children obey. And sometimes maybe we put greater expectations upon our children than we should, and that's wrong. But then again, it would also be wrong not to put expectations upon our children. So let's think about the second part of that question for just a moment. How should it be done, Todd?
Well, like I was going to say, Joshua does have a smart dad in Chad. But I like that because sometimes spanking is associated with parents who are uneducated. They don't know any other. They're attacked by saying you don't know any other way to discipline other than spanking, and so it has this connotation for a less than civilized, less than intelligent way
So
of
you're
discipline.
saying that's the perception
That is the perception.
some have, that
That's
if you
right.
spank, well, you're just not intelligent.
That's right. That's right.
And that's
sad.
absolutely false, isn't it?
Absolutely, it is. It is a form of teaching discipline, and I like that Chad brought that out. That you're teaching this child about consequences. You're teaching the child about the authority, your authority as a parent, and so it again, as you mentioned, Brother Barrett, that it's a tool that you have as a parent to use to convey that message and teaching them about discipline, and then understanding, how you do it and what age also means that I want to learn first about the child. I can tell you, I asked this question with my first son, because I wasn't sure. And this was when around he was like 1.5, and he wasn't, there really hadn't come up a lot of situations, I guess, in my mind where I needed to spank him. Right. If he didn't come at 1 year old, I went and got him. I mean, that's just my experience. Not saying it's wrong for a person who says if you call a child and they don't come, that you should discipline. But it did come to a point, and I remember this, when I asked Micah to do something, and I looked in his eyes, and I could tell he knew what I was asking, and he chose not to do it. And so at that point,
that's important there. That you're saying it was a deliberate disobedience.
That's it.
As I was thinking about this question myself, there were 3 points, principles really, that I thought about that I'd like to share with those of you in this program today. And that is, how should it be done? Number 1, in view of the action. And I think it touches on what you just said. Was it deliberate or was it unintentional? The purpose of discipline is to help teach. And we need to make a distinction between deliberate rebellion and unintentional, just a mistake maybe the child has made. But secondly, in view of the age, I think a problem that occurs sometimes is parents may put too great of an expectation upon a child. And that sometimes comes from, just being an inexperienced parent, and we all do it. We have to learn. It's a growing process. Someone said, the problem with parenthood is by the time you become an expert, your children are all grown. We need to think about the age of the child. Am I talking about a 2-year-old? Or am I talking about, a 12-year-old? We need to think about that. Number 3, in view of the attitude of the child. Again, that touches on whether it was deliberate or whether it was unintentional. What is the attitude? Is this a sweet, loving child who was trying and just simply made a mistake? Or was this child expressing rebellion? I think those are some points that we need to think about. We have another question here that ties in with that I would like to raise. It says, what is the best way to discipline a 5-year-old for stealing something from the store? Who would like to tackle that?
I think one thing that we were talking about the other question that I think, realize that each child is an individual. I've heard numerous people say, I have one child that I have to spank him to get his attention. Another child, I say, don't do that, in a stern voice, and the child starts crying.
Yeah.
Every child is an individual. Discipline has to be administered in love. It can never be done in anger, especially when it comes to a spanking.
Yeah.
But to answer this question about how do you discipline a 5-year-old who has stolen something from the store, I think there are multiple ways you could go about this and do the right thing. When I was growing up, if you took something from the store, first of all, the long arm of the law in the form of mom and dad came down upon you swiftly, and I would get a spanking, but it didn't end there. I was taken to the store to talk to the manager to explain that I stole from him. And of course, I grew up in a small town, so a lot of times you went and talked to the owner. And I would have to explain, I stole from your store. And I'm sorry that I did that, and it will never happen again. And I, that's what happened. And I think that's a good example to teach the child, not only that there is a punishment in the form of, in my situation, it was in the form of a spanking for taking that, but also I had to go back to confess my fault to the owner of the store and tell him I'm sorry that I took this. And then in some situations I would end up having to do household chores and things to offset the money, even after I returned it. Or sometimes you take something that's a piece of candy and you eat it.
Yeah.
You can't exactly return it.
No.
And in those situations, we would be made to work for mom and dad to do, like I said, household chores or things until she felt like you had earned enough to pay for what you took. And then that would cover.
I think that's some excellent advice that you've given there, Chad, and hopefully those who are viewing the program today might consider that as well if they ever have that unfortunate situation, which perhaps they will. I mean, children do things like that from time to time. Here's another question that has to do with a small child. I'll raise this question to Todd. How do I correct a 2-year-old who's picked up a blasphemous phrase and loves to repeat it? Well, that's a problem today, isn't it? Because of the influence of TV. And a little child can hear somebody say something, even at school. A 2-year-old may not be at school or maybe preschool, but nevertheless, children will pick up words, phrases, and they'll repeat it and love to repeat it, and it gets attention of everybody. They don't even know what they're saying. But how do you deal with a situation like that?
I can tell you, I have dealt with that, not only at 2, but on up. Because, of course, as a child becomes school age, they get around other children, other parents. Unfortunately, as their environment broadens, you don't just think about all the things they're exposed to. I can remember my oldest son coming and telling me about things he saw written on a bathroom wall, and I just felt how sad that here is an innocent child having to see that. But oftentimes, what we can do is handle it matter-of-factly. And what I mean by that is give them, first, a complete, clear understanding that this is not appropriate. Okay, this is negative, it's wrong, it's not something that pleases mommy and daddy, doesn't please God. Help them to understand that, and then at the same time, correct them. And I'll often use the example and say, well, that's just something, I'll say it's something rude, it's something inappropriate. I'll use that from time to time, and I say, mommy and daddy don't use that word, or we don't use that phrase. And as we have opportunity, I'll say more. if it comes up, it may be even on television or something, and sometimes phrases come up. And there are several things that my sons now know, no, that's a naughty word, that's a bad word, or that's inappropriate. They shouldn't have said that. And so I try to reinforce it in that way rather than, I guess, just punishing them, spanking them for it in that instance. I don't know if that helps as they mature to deal with that ongoing, because it may start at one phrase or one statement, but again, as their environment grows, they're going to be bombarded with so much. And I want to make sure that, as a father, that they come and ask me. And there was just another day, my son asked me about a phrase someone said to him. And at first, when he mentioned it, because it had to do with the word gay, I didn't know exactly what he was talking about. And so I said, well, explain to me how it was said or when they said it. And when he did, I realized it had nothing really to do with the particular homosexual meaning of that word, but something else. It's just a phrase mentioned by kids.
And that's a good point, because, as preachers, I know my daughter on one occasion, she said, Daddy said a bad word, Daddy said a bad word. I said, what's she talking about? And she said, you said a bad word in your sermon. I said, I did. She said, yeah. She said, you said H-E-L-L. And I, had to take time to talk with her about that and the context and how, that word was not being used in a bad way in sense as just a bad word. I was talking about the place of hell and what the Bible teaches about that. So that's a good point. And children, they have to learn these things, as they grow older. Well, our time has expired very quickly, and we didn't get to finish these questions. So perhaps on another program we can continue with some of these good questions. But I thank you for being with us. We thank you for being with us today for Fabric of the Family. Until next time, I'm Barry Gilreath. Good day.
Let's make the most of a minute.
Timer button selected. Screen record.